Today we're going to look at 5 of the worst and scariest segments of Route 66. Let's be honest, when Route 66 began, it was just awful.
In fact, it was one of our first, busiest, and deadliest long-distance roads. Cars were new, roads were new, and as a nation, we weren't good at either one, at least not yet. So let's take a look at the road known for its fun times in a different way. To be truthful, there are areas of it you wouldn't have wanted to drive back then. That's why we're calling this episode
Nightmare 66.
And stick around with us till the end because we're going to show you how you can still drive 4 of these 5 segments. Just south of Santa Fe, New Mexico, lies a mesa known for its towering heights, loose gravel, and gut-wrenching drops.
This is LaBada Hill. Taking Route 66, the 14 flat miles out from Santa Fe, you arrive here at the end of the mesa, where it plummets over 1,000 feet to the valley floor. With greater than an 8% grade, the highway conceals no less than 28 switchbacks. Unknowing travelers were in for an experience on the drive to Albuquerque. Looking back at the face of the hill, it looks like an unusual staircase cut into the rock. One thing you will also note, not one guardrail on this pass. You might ask, why place the highway here, on such a dangerous spot? La Bajada, which actually means the descent in Spanish, predates Route 66 by several years. This was the path of the famous El Camino Real that ran from Mexico City to Santa Fe. The trail had been used for nearly 300 years before the first automobiles arrived. If you played it safe, it was 10 miles an hour or less at best on La Bajada, meaning a long day getting from Santa Fe to Albuquerque. After just a handful of years, it was rerouted on a longer but safer route. In fact, it wouldn't be much longer until the entire portion known as the Santa Fe Loop was completely removed from Route 66, saving travelers nearly 4 hours of driving.
In the Black Mountains of Arizona, between the towns of Kingman and Oatman, lies the Oatman Highway.
This treacherous stretch snaked its way up through the countryside, over the Sitgreaves Pass, before finding its way to the old mining community of Oatman. Early cars and early drivers loathed this climb or descent. Most of the autos in the 1920s still utilized what was known as a gravity-fed fuel system, meaning there was no pump. On a steep hill or road, they simply lost gas feed. So the most common workaround was to turn around. You see, driving backwards kept the gas going downhill as you climbed the mountain. So many drivers would situate their cars backwards and drive up this no guardrail road in reverse. That is what you call nerves of steel. To some motorists, that simply wasn't an option they wanted to try. Never fear though, in came mule and horse teams, ready to hitch you up and drag you to the top of the mountain for a hefty chunk of change. Wreckers were available too, but in very limited quantities. And if that wasn't good enough for the fearful traveler, you could hire a local driver to take you to the pass and beyond. Well, this frightening stretch of road was finally bypassed in 1953, taking a new route south of Kingman. But you can still brave it if you dare.
Well, after World War II, cars got bigger and faster. But the problem was that roads didn't often grow with them.
This is the Mojave Desert, between Amboy and Essex, California, where Route 66 blazes a trail through the extreme heat and dust. The bridges seen here appear to be really out of place, considering they are built in the middle of the desert. Well, that's true, unless you are passing through in the rainy season, when wide washes flow millions of gallons of water through the area. Check this one out. Most of the little bridges were built way before the route system, going back to the horse-drawn era. So when the bigger, faster vehicles came on scene, they didn't like narrow 17 or 18-foot wide track bridges. Collisions, mostly head-on, were common, as there were no real warning signs for the drivers. Wrecker drivers responding to the area had a lot of horror stories to tell about the vehicles and their occupants, impaled on the pointed wooden posts used for guardrails on these crossings, or that many were flung several feet away from their seatbelt-free cars. As you can see in the modern photos, they are wider, but often this section is closed due to bridge damage and ongoing repair.
We go back to Arizona for this one, and that's not a surprise, because in 1926, only 5% of Arizona was paved. Route 66 through the state accounted for 1 in 7 accidents.
A large part of that tally was accredited to a hill descending from Williams to the community of Ashfork, Arizona. It was simply known as Ashfork Hill, and it struck fear in drivers attempting it. This road was unpaved for the most part. Cars came down Bill Williams Mountain. The road hugged it, and it was a narrow track against a rock wall. Much of the mountain portion had to be hollowed out to make room for the road. Also, highway engineering wasn't quite state-of-the-art yet. For one thing, it did not include modern stormwater runoff culverts. So, water being water, it found any path it could, which mainly was under the road. Pictured here is one major collapse in this area directly due to the omission of the culverts. Add to that the guardrail-free curves, and you have a familiar sight for a century ago, a deadly road that was difficult to stay on. It was straightened some in 1932, as you can see here. This portion is still around today and used mainly as a bike path. Well, the two-lane is gone now, and the I-40 corridor and modern highway have taken over. It's a much safer drive and a breathtaking view.
For our final entry, we have the road that may have brought us the interstate system, or at least made us think very hard about it.
Deep in the Missouri Ozarks is a little town named after a bizarre bend in the Big Piney River. Loggers who were using it to transport their lumber hated this shift and turn more than any other, so they named it aptly Devil's Elbow. Pictured here is the narrow bridge that Route 66 used as its crossing until June of 1945. And while it was accident-prone, it was actually the portion just past it that became infamous as a death trap. In 1 year, almost a mile away from the bridge, over 413 accidents occurred, killing over 50 motorists. But why here? Why now? Fort Leonard Wood, a newer base, was built in this area to support the training of our troops for World War II. Though the base was up to date, the roadways were not. They were ill-prepared for the heavy traffic and large military vehicles that were transported through the hills. Up until then, they were still dirt paths. Taking a look at this segment, a road only 16 feet wide, a major drop on one side, and a shoulderless rock wall on the other. The worst part was there was no guardrail to keep you on this road. To be sure, it was a white-knuckled experience. Route 66 was so hated by travelers and the Army in this area that it was one of the prime examples used to drive the interstate, highway, and defense system. Let's face it, they could not safely get troops, machinery, nor civilians to and from the base, and that had to change. Just a few miles away from Devil's Elbow, one of the first rock cuts of its kind was blasted through the hills to make room for a 4-lane section named after a small town nearby. We are looking at what is known as the Hooker Cut, and I guess you could say it served as a template for how roads would be built in the future. This new type of road pretty much laid its path out and blasted through anything in its way. So the Devil's Elbow community was bypassed by the Hooker Cut, which, ironically, was later bypassed by Interstate 44. And so the story goes. Yes, it was rough to drive on roads in 1926 all the way up into the 50s, and I think we've come a long way in safety improvements since then.
So now that we've seen 5 of the scariest points on Route 66, we have Google links in the show notes. Now, we don't recommend going to LaBada Hill because that is on Native American land, but the other 4 are more than welcoming to tourists. Please consider being a part of our family and subscribing. Safe travels to you, and God bless.